My buddies and I never graduated high school. None of us really took school as seriously as we should have. Throughout our years, we stayed in detention and the principal's office. We weren't bad kids or troublemakers or anything like that, but we often goofed around and got a kick out of being the class clowns. As a result of that, we rarely got any work done, scraping by doing just the bare minimum. By the time we made it to 10th grade, all three of us decided to drop out, one by one. Now that I'm in my early 20s, not much has changed. I've been working various dead-end jobs ever since leaving high school. I worked at a local burger joint as a cashier, apart from my friends, Chris and Mike. Chris worked as a janitor at a supermarket, while Mike was an associate at a movie theater on the other side of town. Living in an area where the cost of housing was relatively high meant that we couldn't afford to pay the rent every month, making just a little over minimum wage. So all three of us lived together in an apartment. Aside from our day jobs, we'd also engage in a few active miscellaneous side hustles to get some extra pocket change every now and then, mostly Uber or DoorDash. But there was one side hustle we did occasionally, maybe twice a month. Often we'd sneak out to the cemetery and desecrate some graves, mostly mausoleums because they were quick and easy to break into. Then depending on what was inside them, we'd go pawn the items and split the cash. Most of the time we didn't find anything worth pawning, but every blue moon we'd come across some corpse that would be buried with a piece of gold or some other kind of valuable item. We found that an older woman had passed away. It was actually someone we often saw around town regularly. Caitlyn Sanders was her name. She died at 64 years old. It wasn't someone we personally knew or spoke to at all, but it was someone we were very familiar with. We've been seeing her around for years, yet none of us even knew her name until we found out she died. While she was alive, she worked as a real estate agent, helping clients buy and sell homes on the more luxurious side of town. Her occupation gave us the impression that she was at least somewhat wealthy, and would most likely be buried with something we could definitely use. Caitlyn was financially well, but she didn't live in the high-class neighborhood she often did business in. Her home wasn't located too far from us. It was about 7 or 8 blocks away from our apartment. According to the few sources we found on the internet, Caitlyn wasn't going to have a funeral service or a cemetery burial. Her sister was going to take ownership of the property, then bury Caitlyn right in her own backyard. One night, all three of us went to Caitlyn's house to find her grave. Her house was 2 stories tall, with many doors and windows. The yard was fairly large, containing lots of well-groomed shrubbery and small bushes. An iron gate, along with many trees, surrounded the yard. After climbing the gate, we searched the yard for a few minutes until we came across a small house-like structure sitting towards the backyard. I clicked on my flashlight and shined it on the building as we got close. The mini house-like structure had double doors and 2 Doric columns going down both sides. A short chain and lock bound the 2 doors together. The material on the house looked like it was marble, as it was covered in swirly patterns. The entire thing resembled that of a classical Rome building. I shined my light towards the top, then we saw Caitlyn's full name carved across the roof. Chris pulled a pair of bolt cutters from his utility bag before breaking the lock. Then we pulled the 2 marble doors open as they scraped the concrete ground below. At first we stared at nothing but darkness inside. Dust floated amidst the beams of our flashlights as we shined them around. Then we saw that the walls had strange symbols carved into them. "Now what the hell is all this shit?" Mike said, waving his light around. Most of the symbols were unrecognizable. There were a few simple shapes of animals here and there, birds, snakes, along with a few bull or cow-like creatures. I also saw some outlines of stylistic eyes. but the symbol that stood out the most was one of two human arms. They were connected, forming a U shape containing two intertwined snakes between them. This symbol was the largest, being emphasized over everything else. The eye symbols looked slightly familiar to me. I've seen it being referenced numerous times in pop culture, but at that moment I couldn't think of it. The Eye of Horror. Although it was at the tip of my tongue, I still didn't stand a chance. Our flashlights all came together to spot a burial vault sitting in the middle of the pitch black room. The vault had a metal cage with spaced bars on the front, allowing us to see one side of a casket lying in there. Chris cut the bars using his bolt cutters, then pried them back with the crowbar. Afterwards, Mike and I helped Chris slide the very heavy casket out. Chris used the crowbar to pop the lids open. I squinted and mentally braced myself, because although we've been doing this for a decent amount of time, I still wasn't quite used to personally seeing corpses just yet. We all pointed our flashlights inside the casket, then we saw her. "Hell yeah, fucking jackpot," Mike said. Caitlyn's slightly rotting body was lying inside, her overlapped hands resting on her stomach. Her face was riddled with a few black spots here and there from the gangrene slowly eating away at her. Other than the small rotting areas on her body, she looked almost the same. She was dressed in her usual businesswoman suit and skirt, a uniform we often saw her wearing when she was living. What had caused Mike's outburst was the sight of all the jewelry Caitlyn was wearing. The gold tattering her fingers and neck was nearly enough to distract us from her body. She had 3 gold rings on her rotting fingers of each of her hands, while her wrist held several gold bracelets. Around her neck was an oddly shaped necklace. It was a golden wedge with a thin string attached that looped around her neck. Mike reached forward and removed one of her rings. A slight cracking sound came from Caitlyn's dead and cold finger. I took about 2 rings off of her fingers, then placed them on mine, observing them up close. The frequent dents and nicks around the edges of the rings, along with the asymmetric round shapes, gave me the impression that they were old. I took them off again and searched for small diamonds or gems. There weren't any. Chris stared into the casket for a minute before finally deciding to go for the bracelets around her wrists. He stopped before touching them, then turned to me. Kenny, you mind grabbing those?" Chris asked. He still didn't like touching the bodies. I slid some of the bracelets off Caitlyn's wrists, then handed them to Chris. He looked at them in the palm of his hands for a second before stuffing them into his bag. With most of the rings still on my fingers, I removed the peculiar necklace from around her neck and placed it in my pocket. Mike and I grabbed a few more of the rings, and I handed Chris the rest of the bracelets. After closing the casket and shoving it back into the vault, Chris grew a spare chain and replaced the one he broke on the door. We left excited, thinking that what we found was just another luck haul. The next day, we took the jewelry to a pawn shop that was owned by a guy we had known for a few years. His name was Jerry, and we met him months after leaving school. Jerry was an older guy in his 50s, and he's been running that pawn shop for about a decade. He often got decent business there too. Being struggling dropouts and all, we often went there to pawn everything we came across, trying to get a hold of every dime possible. Jerry was always willing to lend a helping hand to us. He made sure he gave us the best deals and bargains. Every now and then, just one good bargain with Jerry meant having our share of the rent paid off for the month, or getting a savings stash started. When we walked in the pawn shop, Jerry was posted behind the counter. He smirked when he saw us. "What you rascals done dug up now?" Jerry said. He's known about our side hustle for a while. Months after we started, we told him about it. Then, strangely enough, he shrugged it off and laughed. "I don't care how the hell you bring me the money, as long as I get it," I remembered him spewing out while chuckling hysterically. All three of us approached the counter, right away pulling out our shares of the gold jewelry and sitting it on top. Jerry's eyes widened, filling with delight. "God damn, where the hell did you boys find this?" Jerry said, picking up one of the bracelets and observing it. Jerry grabbed his portable magnifying glass dangling from the silver pocket chain on his waist before getting an even closer look at the jewelry. Then he took the jewelry to the back to weigh the grams. Turns out Mike was right. We did hit the jackpot indeed. The jewelry was of 14 karat gold. Altogether it weighed in at 226 grams, which is 8 ounces. Jerry said that was a stash worth almost $10,000. It was the biggest piece of treasure we found yet, along with the biggest break in terms of living. After minutes of negotiation and compromise, we managed to walk out with $3,000 in total. We each got $1,000 after splitting the cash. It felt good to still have some extra money left over after paying my dues. It's been a while since I've been able to save a decent amount in my bank account without having to worry about giving it up on some kind of never-ending necessity. That might have been the biggest and only head start I was going to get for a while, so I tried to make it last. Mike has always spent the majority of his disposable income on women. That month was no different. Despite being a low-income worker with no ambition and barely a place to stay, Mike was a ladies' man by nature. He often hooked up with lots of different women and engaged in many short-term relationships. Chris bought a cheap video camera for under $100, as he wanted to start a YouTube channel. He had a thing for firearms and planned on creating gun review videos. He already had a small collection of pistols in his room, and a few shotguns, something that was only possible because of good old Jerry. Over time, we started to experience strange physical symptoms. I felt some pain in my chest area, then eventually my entire body started aching. It started out small and minor during the first few days, but it got so bad I could barely get out of bed without cringing in agony. At first I thought it was just me, until Chris and Mike said they were also feeling a bit weird. Chris complained of a constant throbbing pain in his jaw, which eventually shot across his entire mandible. Mike, on the other hand, experienced some mean headaches. Those headaches turned into a severe fever, and it made Mike's face turn almost a beet red. He had to take off from work for almost 2 weeks because of it. The strange symptoms soon faded, but it wasn't over yet. Nightmares started to plague our sleep. The first one to get a taste of this was Chris. Mike and I were shot wide awake by screaming in the middle of the night. That was followed by Chris screaming and crying. I hopped out of bed and rushed to Chris's room. When I got there, Mike was already standing over him, shaking him hard while Chris wriggled around and wildly through his limbs. I joined Mike in shaking Chris and trying to get him awake. "Chris!" I shouted. After a minute he woke up, hyperventilating with sweat covering his face. He started gazing around the room in confusion. Chris said he dreamt of a man following him in the dark. He wasn't sure where he was, but there was nothing but darkness around him. The man looked lifeless, like a corpse. His face lacked any emotion, and his skin was so dead to the point of resembling a dark gray color. But what he noticed first was his eyes. They were as black as the darkness that surrounded them. Chris suddenly found himself sprawled across the ground while being repeatedly stumped in the face by the strange man, particularly in his jaw. This continued for a few nights. Chris would wake us up with his screams and cries for help throughout the night. Then Mike and I would run in his room and shake him awake. Chris would dream about that same corpse-like man attacking him in the same manner every time. It was only a matter of time until Mike and I got the same experience. Just like Chris, I would dream about a man chasing me every night. It was chilling to see that the man in my dreams looked exactly the way Chris described him. Very dead looking, with gray skin and jet black eyes. When I wasn't running from the man, My limbs were being broken by him. He was using his bare hands, just bending and popping my arms and legs in very unnatural angles as I screeched away in the darkness. While Chris was at work one day, Mike revealed that he was having dreams too, of the same man. He told me he kept seeing a dead man visiting him. The way the man chose to torment Mike, however, was just slightly more weird than what Chris and I experienced. The man would crawl on top of Mike, pinning him down with one hand before bashing him in the face with the rock. Mike always woke up after being struck the first time. I didn't know what to think after that. Mike and I thought it was strange that we were dreaming of the same man every night. We didn't have a clue how that could even happen, or why it was happening. Chris and I were in the apartment alone. Mike had run off on a date with another one of his women and planned on being gone for the rest of the night. He told us he was going to stay the night at the woman's house and should be back by the next day around noon. I was on the first floor of our apartment complex, on the porch smoking a cigarette while scrolling away on my phone. Chris sat up in his room cleaning his guns and setting up the new camera he bought, as he planned on recording his first video. While taking multiple drags of my cigarette, I hear Chris scream, followed by a loud bang. I jumped, dropping my cigarette. "Chris!" I shouted. I rushed up to our apartment and swung the door wide open, starting for Chris's room. But before I stepped in, all the lights went out, leaving the entire apartment nearly pitch black. The only sources of light in the room were the lit numbers on the microwave and the oven in the kitchen, along with a slight amount of moonlight shining in through the window in the dining room area. "Chris, what happened?" I shouted again. No answer. "Chris?" I shouted. Still nothing. I accidentally rammed my leg against the table as I couldn't see where I was going, so I turned on the light on my phone to help see my way around the blackness. I reached Chris's room and shined my phone's light around until I spotted him standing in front of his open closet, back facing me. His arms dangled down at his sides. He just stood there, standing stiff and not making any movements or sounds. "Chris," I said. He wouldn't respond to anything I was saying, so I reached forward and gently spun him around using one hand. I screamed when I saw his face, then started backing away with my hand over my mouth. Chris's bottom jaw had been ripped away. His tongue dangled down and moved from side to side over his exposed throat. Most of his top teeth were missing, leaving nothing but destroyed gums behind. I shined the light to the floor and discovered his jaw lying in the middle of a mini blood pool. He reached out and tried to grab me, but I backed away, shocked as I shined my light on his grotesque face. Who did this to you?" I stammered. He couldn't answer. Chris dropped to the floor. I was about to run out of the room, but I was stopped by something blocking me. My light was beaming on someone's body, and it looked like they were clothed in a gray coverall. As I slowly moved my light up the mystery person's chest, I saw that whoever was standing in front of me was holding one of Chris's shotguns in his hand. My jaws dropped when I shined the light in their face. It was a man, and he had gray skin, jet black eyes, and an emotionless expression. "Who the fuck are you?" I said. He didn't answer. He cocked the shotgun and aimed it right at my face. I tackled him to the ground and tried to take the shotgun away from him before he could shoot, but the man was incredibly strong. After failing to disarm him, I just got up and ran out of the apartment, leaving the man on the floor and not bothering to close the door behind me. When I got back on the first floor again, I dashed across the parking lot and approached my car. I tried to open the door, but it was locked, and I just realized I didn't have my keys with me. I gazed back and saw the man creeping towards me, shotgun still in hand. He raised the gun then fired, missing me but shattering the window on the passenger side of my car. My alarm went off instantly, echoing out into the night. I realized I had dropped my cell phone. It was lying on the ground, face down behind the man. There was no way I was getting that back without being blown away. I spun back around and just sprinted out of the parking lot as multiple gunshots went off behind me. I decided to go visit Mike and his current girlfriend a few blocks away. I had to tell Mike what had happened. Plus, I needed to use their phone to call the police. I searched for the address Mike had told Chris and I he'd be at earlier. Then I spotted a small house with a white car sitting in the driveway. I couldn't remember the exact number of the residence, but I did know the street, and I thought that was the house Mike was pointing to before. I really hoped that was the right one. Rushing to the door, I immediately started knocking multiple times while constantly glancing behind me. The black-eyed man followed me halfway there, and I barely lost him, so I was still on the lookout. After seconds, there still wasn't anyone answering the door, so I knocked again. "Mike," I said. "Please, it's me, Kenny." Low sounds of someone crying is what I got instead. Then the crying grew louder. It sounded feminine, like a girl. Had to be Mike's girlfriend. "Hey, anyone in there?" I yelled. Just more crying. I stepped back and rammed into the door, busting it open. As soon as I stepped in, I heard a scream, occupied by multiple wet thumping noises. The entire house was a bit dark, so I flipped a light switch nearby on the wall. The power was out there too. "Mike," I said. The sounds of crying led me to a bedroom with a door that was wide open. A fluorescent blue light illuminated the room. I slowly made my way in, careful not to dive into whatever may have been waiting. There was a young woman sitting in the corner of the room, balled up and hugging her knees. She was shaking uncontrollably, tears streaming down her face. The light had been coming from a small lantern sitting beside her. She let out a scream when she saw me walk in. I trotted over to her while shushing her repeatedly. "Please stop," I said. "Listen, I'm friends with Mike and something terrible just happened to someone else we know. Now where is Mike?" She started crying again when I asked that. Then she glanced over at the bed on the other side of the room. The sheets were stained with blood, and the walls had blood dripping down them. There was also a bulge beneath the sheets. I went over to the bed and yanked the sheets away, only to find Mike's battered face staring back at me. That's only if it could be called a face anymore. All there was a mushy mix of blood and crunched bone in place of the face I was once able to recognize. One of his eyeballs dangled down the side of his crushed skull. My eyes filled with tears. Then I threw the sheet back over him again before turning back around. He killed him," she cried. "Who killed him?" I asked, tears streaming down my face. She hesitated before answering. It was some guy with black eyes," she said. My heart dropped to my stomach when she said this. "He came out of nowhere and attacked him," she cried. "Well, why didn't you call the police?" I asked. "The power went out, and when he first came in, I threw my cell phone at him in a panic. Then he smashed my phone. I didn't hear him leave, so I've been scared to leave the room ever since," she explained. Her last sentence made me come to a chilling realization. He was still in the house. I was about to pull her out of the corner, but before I even took one step, that's when I saw him standing in the doorway. A man. Another man. This wasn't the same guy I was currently running from, but he was similar. He also had black eyes and gray skin. This man wore glasses, and he was bald. Instead of a shotgun, he was holding a sledgehammer. The young woman screamed. Then the guy came trotting towards me, hammer raised in the air. He lunged forward and took a swing. He missed and instead drove the hammer into the wall behind me, knocking a huge hole into it. The young woman stood up and grabbed a curtain bar nearby before repeatedly hitting the man across his body. He didn't seem to have any reaction to being hit. It didn't look like he could feel pain at all. He turned and instantly laid her out cold with a whack across the head with his hammer. She fell to the ground, blood leaking from her split head. I ran past him and rushed out of the house. After leaving the young woman's house, I didn't know where to go. I've tried walking up to a few houses and knocking on doors. As expected, no one answered. Couldn't really blame them. I wouldn't answer the door past midnight either. I could see Caitlyn's house from a distance. I didn't realize I had run that far. As I was about to make my way past the gates, I was surprised to see an older woman standing behind them. I glanced her way, then kept running, but stopped when I saw that she was gesturing for me to come to her. A wide grin spread across her face. Who was she? Had to be Caitlyn's sister. I glanced behind me only to see the sledgehammer guy creeping towards me beneath the streetlight. Please come. I have something important to share with you, the old woman said, unlocking the gates and opening one of the doors. Her grin grew wider when she saw the man following me. Reluctantly, I did what she asked and went in. She slammed the gate shut, then secured both doors with the latch. She led me into the house. The first thing I see is a spiral staircase that leads up to the second floor. There was an office with a burning fireplace to the left of us, and the living room was on the right. 2 candles flickered away in the living room. One on a coffee table in the center of the room with a tea kettle and a mug with a book sitting beside it. The other candle sat on the china cabinet near one of the windows. The woman went into the living room and sat on one of the sofas next to the coffee table. I followed, sitting down across from her. She still had that smile on her face. It was starting to creep me out, and I was beginning to regret my decision to follow her in there. You boys have no idea what you've gotten yourselves into, she said. I didn't know what she was speaking of, but by the sound of it already, it didn't seem good. What? I said. She giggled. The jewelry, she replied. Trust me, there's a lot more to it than what meets the eye. I swallowed hard, eyes wide while staring back at her. I don't know what... Come on, son. I saw you guys do it, she interrupted. There was an awkward silence. I was going to call the police when I looked out my window and saw you guys breaking into my sister's tomb. But I figured you already had something better coming your way, she continued. She leaned forward and poured herself some tea before taking a sip. But it was nice of you to clean up after yourselves, she said. I could only sit there and stare. So, why did you bring me in here exactly? I asked, fidgeting. Grave robbery, she started, ignoring my question. Although it's relatively rare today, it was a huge problem hundreds and thousands of years ago, particularly during the ancient times in Egypt, she continued. You see, my sister and I just so happen to be related to an important figure in history that you may or may not have heard of. Are you familiar with any of the female pharaohs of ancient Egypt? I nodded my head no. I had some memories of Egyptian lectures in school, but I never paid attention long enough to absorb much information. Well, most pharaohs throughout history were men, but there were anywhere from 7 to 15 female pharaohs in Egypt, the most popular ones being Hatshepsut, Cleopatra VII, and Nefertiti. It's widely believed that Sobekneferu was the first amongst them all, but that's not true. The first woman to get any power of that kind was a long-lost descendant in our bloodline, Aziza, the woman explained. I really didn't know where she was going with this. Aziza was a very powerful pharaoh indeed. In fact, she was more powerful than Hatshepsut, who is believed to have been the most powerful Egyptian woman ruler ever. Although powerful, Aziza was a kind and merciful leader. She was well liked and respected by the people. Unlike most people throughout ancient Egyptian history, the poor under Aziza's rule were not limited to bread and beer when it came to staying fed. They got to enjoy the luxury of meat and wine, along with the other foods that were typically reserved for the rich. Overall, Aziza had the poor living under much better conditions than what anyone would expect. But despite Aziza's great treatment to the people, there were still many bad apples here and there. "Like you guys," she said, pointing at me. I gave her a slight frown. I couldn't believe I was listening to this. Many became ungrateful and greedy. Then robbers started stealing jewelry and other valuable things from the resting pharaohs' tombs. After this went on for some time, Aziza became fed up with the dishonesty, so she put a spell on all the items of the dead pharaohs, and her own also. "Oh, so voodoo then," I said sarcastically. "No, not voodoo. In Egypt, they practice something called Heka," she explained, opening the book on the table and revealing a familiar-looking symbol on one of the pages. 2 connected human arms that formed a U, with intertwined snakes in the middle. It was the large symbol we saw in Caitlyn's tomb. Heka was used for things like healing, getting rid of harmful poisons, and stripping people of harmful spirits, she replied. But it could also be used for more darker intentions, such as punishment. Those who stole anything else from the tombs after the spell would face greater than dire consequences. The punishment for busted tomb robbers was death, but those who weren't caught would be in just as much trouble. Worse, actually. "And exactly how?" I asked. We heard a loud bang beside us, then turned to see the sledgehammer guy banging on the window outside with his fist, staring in at us through the glass. The woman grinned once again, then continued talking. "Raiders who thought they'd escaped fate would be hunted down by the forces, then killed severely," she said. "This also goes for anyone else outside the pharaoh bloodline who unethically takes ownership of any of the cursed items." "What forces?" I asked. "They come in many forms," she replied. "They show up as people, animals, and many more. But before they come after the person, or the thief, the victim may start out with feeling minor physical ailments. That will turn into horrific dreams at night. Then finally," she pointed to the sledgehammer guy, still grinning. It took a moment to realize what she was trying to tell me. My eyes widened when I got the message. "Are you saying we have this curse?" I said. She nodded. "You've been marked." "What?" I said, puzzled. I stood up and began pacing the floor in a panic. Then I took a quick glance at the guy standing outside. His face followed me as I moved back and forth. "Well, I'm sure there's some way I can get this off, right?" I said. "I'm afraid not. The curse is permanent. The forces will pursue you for the rest of your life. Or until it kills you," she explained. "Are you fucking kidding me?" I shouted. "There has to be some way I can get this off. There has to be." "There isn't. However, if you still have the jewelry or know where it is, I suggest you get at least a piece of it back. It's going to be the key to keeping your life," she said. I turned and looked at her. "How? How the hell is that going to help me now?" I yelled. "The jewelry is a suppressant to the forces. They'll follow you around, but they won't be able to harm you, as long as you wear at least a piece of the jewelry," she explained. At that moment, I thought of someone else, Jerry. I wondered if he still had the jewelry in his pawn shop. The old woman chuckled. Then she started laughing maniacally. "You're fucking crazy, lady," I shouted. "Good luck," she said, before continuing laughing. When she said that, the man outside shattered the window with his sledgehammer, before climbing in and walking towards me. I turned to run away but tripped over the sofa. I got up quickly, but not quick enough. The man was already on my tail. and that struck me in the leg with the hammer. The old woman snickered upon hearing a slight pop in my leg. The sharp pain didn't stop me from dashing my way around the man before jumping the window he just shattered and limping my way across the yard. Jerry's shop was closed, of course, but I planned on breaking in to get what I needed, and there was no time to wait until the shop opened the next day. I was hoping Jerry hadn't sold all the jewelry yet. I went to the side of the building and busted one of the windows with a brick I found lying nearby before climbing in. I made my way through the dim shop and peered inside of the showcases to see if I could spot some of the jewelry lying inside. There was no sign of it. Afterwards, I went to the back room. As soon as I stepped in, an alarm went off throughout the entire shop. Must have triggered a sensor somewhere. I forgot all about Jerry's security system. At that moment, I had even less time to find what I needed. I rambled through several drawers and small compartments and found a small pile of gold necklaces and bracelets, but none of them was what I was looking for. I even checked Jerry's office. After all that searching, I still came up with nothing. When I stepped out of Jerry's office, I saw the man standing in the doorway. That was strange, because I didn't hear anyone come in, but it was too late to hide, and the back room was pretty small and narrow. There was no way I was going to get around him that time. I turned and took off, busting through the emergency exit behind me. Then I turned and slammed the door in the man's face. He started banging on the door, and did that for minutes. I was surprised these guys couldn't open a simple door but had the instinct to use weapons such as guns. Before taking off, I noticed something lying on top of one of the dumpsters. To me, it looked like a pair of legs. I walked to the back of the dumpster and saw just that, a pair of human legs, wearing worn out blue jeans and black boots. But the person's torso, along with the rest of their body, was missing. Entrails spilled out from the top. My eyes grew watery when I noticed a pocket chain hanging out of one of the pockets. After seconds of staring at the legs in sheer shock, they toppled over and fell to the ground, some of the bloody intestines splattering across the pavement. I twitched in fear and stepped back. I saw something fall out of one of the pants pockets and hit the ground. A small piece of gold jewelry. After moving in closer, I discovered a ring. That's when I hear the sound of the door being forced open. The man turned and spotted me right away. That's when I picked up the ring and placed it on my finger. He came and stood right next to me, standing only inches away. I expected him to strike me with the hammer at any second, but he didn't. He just stared, looking into my soul with those charcoal eyes. At that moment, I saw what the jewelry was really capable of. I saw a wisp of flashing light touch the wall behind the man. I spun around to see two police cruisers coming down the road leading to the pawn shop. I ran to the front of the store and stood in the parking lot with my hands in the air, waiting for them to turn in. As soon as the officers stepped out of their cars, they drew their pistols and yelled for me to get down on the ground. I complied, while desperately trying to tell them that it wasn't what it looked like. They wouldn't listen, so I had no choice but to let them handcuff and throw me into the back of one of the cruisers. One of the officers drove me away from the scene. As we pulled off, I could see the man on the side of the building, watching me ride further away from a distance. Now fast forward over 10 years later, I'm in my early 30s and I got my GED along with a bachelor's degree in cybersecurity. I'm now a security analyst at a consulting firm with a very stable source of income. Life has actually been fairly decent for me thus far, although my chances of a better life came close to being ruined earlier on. After the police had taken me into custody, they kept me there all night after interrogating the hell out of me. They knew I broke into the shop. Several of our neighbors at our apartment complex called the police after they heard the gunshot in our apartment. They visited our apartment and found Chris's body. Then the next day they discovered Mike and his girlfriend. My fingerprints were all over the woman's house and the pawn shop where they found half of Jerry's body. To this day, They still haven't found his torso. The amount of murder accusations that came afterwards was endless. They were determined to get a confession out of me. I tried telling them that there was someone after me, but I didn't say a word about the curse and the black-eyed men. Fortunately, they were unable to press many charges due to an insufficient amount of evidence. There were fingerprints, but nothing really pointing to murder. The only thing I was charged with was breaking and entering. The case of my dead friends and Mike's girlfriend has been cold ever since, and they've been on the hunt for a murderer that technically doesn't exist. As for the curse, well, Caitlyn's sister was right. I still remain marked to this day. The black-eyed men still follow me everywhere I go. I'll see slight glimpses of them throughout every day, only to turn and find nothing there. My co-workers think I'm insane when I get jumpy and paranoid at the office. I've discovered that I'm the only one who can see the black-eyed men. At night, things get real. Nightmares aren't a big thing anymore, though they still occur infrequently. But the black-eyed men sure do make up for the torment that the nightmares have lacked. I have to keep my door shut at night, because if I don't shut my door, the men will enter my room and stare at me. They'll stand outside my bedroom door and bang on it continuously. I'll occasionally end up pulling an all-nighter, not only because of the constant noise, but the amount of terror that will build up inside of me while it's happening. Sometimes I swear I'm just one heartbeat away from my chest exploding. To make matters worse, they've started mimicking voices of people I once knew, mostly Chris and Mike, on the other side of the door trying desperately to convince me to remove my ring. "Come on, Ken, just take off that ring and I promise life will get much better for you," one of the men once said, in Chris's voice. When I ignore them, they get agitated and belligerent. "For fuck's sake, Kenny," I heard Mike's voice. "Stop being a hard ass and just take that piece of shit off your hand." Speaking of Chris and Mike, something rang a bell in my mind a few years back. Chris had constant pain in his jaw for days, before having dreams of the black-eyed men stomping him in the face, in the jaw. Then finally, one of the black-eyed men blew his jaw away in real life. Then Mike, on the other hand, had headaches so bad that he had to take off from work. Then he dreamt of being bashed in the head with a rock. The sledgehammer guy gave him a similar fate in reality. Now this has me wondering, is it really possible to keep running away from the curse forever? With some jewelry? Does the curse have someone's fate sealed the moment they take ownership of it? This ring that seems to be saving my ass right now, is it all just temporary after all? Is there something Caitlyn's sister left out and didn't tell me? The fact that I felt pain all over my body. My nightmare was having every limb and possibly every other bone in my body being broken to the extreme. What's that supposed to mean?